I would like to welcome here Ewa Westermark.
Thank you so much for inviting me to have a presentation. I will have to entertain you. Here we go. You hear me too well, maybe? Maybe I need to walk away from the speakers a bit. Yes. Is this better? Hi. So I will talk today about how to connect Tallinn to the waterfront and some of the really important qualities that we're asking as people, that we're needing, some of our needs that we have from city spaces. Because one thing about cities, we know that we have this... I have to go on the stage. I'm just thinking I will make a lot of noise with my feet, but let's try. So we know that we can actually create a city with sustainable buildings, and you can see this example from Ørestad in Denmark, this new city space. Everything is on paper is actually sustainable. It's LEED certified buildings, it's public transportation, bicycle lanes, really nice quality on the materials. But when you're actually on feet, this is the environment. And really, this is not a successful place because it actually doesn't invite people to have a sustainable behavior. It's not a space where you want to walk. It's not a space where you're invited to sit. It's really not a good space for any commercial activities. If you would see a friend on the other side of the street, it would be too big distance. You wouldn't even recognize them. So this is not, in my mind, a sustainable area because it doesn't actually create sustainable places for people. So what is it? What qualities do we demand to be able to walk and wanting to stay in the street? What is it that is needed of a city in order to actually invite grandma and your child to bicycle in the street? It's really about this marriage between life and spaces. We know how much our environment actually influences our behavior. So we have to take this into consideration when we plan and design our cities. And this we have studied for many years, the office and Jan Gehl. You can guess who he is maybe among these young girls, but there are lots of books that has been published on this topic. I know that this one, I have a pointer. This one was published a year or two ago in Estonia as well. What is it called in Estonian? Cities for People. I couldn't say that. But one thing we learned is that if we want people to change behavior, they will not do that because you tell them to. The only way to get people to walk more and bicycle more is if the environment compels you to change behavior. And it's all about us as human beings and our senses and what we need. We are human beings that walk. We're designed to walk in a speed about 5 kilometers an hour. And our senses, we need a lot of stimuli. Our brain gets bored unless we get some kind of stimuli every 4 seconds. And that doesn't have to be busy stimuli. It could be nature stimuli. It could be something that actually is attractive to our senses. And we can actually summarize and say that some spaces have these 5 kilometer an hour qualities. They have 5 kilometer an hour scale. They're places that we like to spend time in. We're invited to walk, we're invited to stay. And of course you have a lot of these 5 kilometers an hour spaces. They're all on your postcards from the old town. And you also have some new spaces that actually has these qualities. But the problem is that you also, all these nice spaces are surrounded by 60 kilometer an hour spaces, where it's not at all inviting to walk. Even though you made the sidewalk in the nicest material, it still wouldn't be a pleasant area to walk in. The signs, the dimensions grow bigger. It's really a space designed for speed. It's designed for cars. And the big challenge is, how do we change this? How do we change the city? And the way we're working today, it's actually an issue that we're thinking of cities as separate system. We have one group of people that are really good with buildings and thinking about who should move in here, what kind of functionality does it need to have. And then we have another group of people that are really experts in moving traffic, in thinking about flows, etc. And another group of people that are focusing on the green aspects of the cities. But really we're not working together. And that's the way we have to go if we want to create spaces for people. Because, of course, we as humans, we're not only visiting a shop. We're, of course, also a pedestrian, and sometimes we sit in a car or in a bus. Sometimes we enjoy the greenery. So we need to start working in a collaborative way and have a holistic approach on how we develop our cities. And of course, how do we put people in the center of this planning process? One thing, of course, you heard, I think, I didn't understand the introductions, but looking at this area and how to connect the central city to the waterfront, I think there are some key things we have to consider. And one thing is, how do we go from this highway design into thinking urban design? How do we actually optimize our spaces, our streets? It's interesting, streets and roads in cities, they usually take up to 80% of all open spaces. This is super valuable space, and I don't think we're using it very effectively when we design these types of spaces. And you know, you have been around, walking in this area is almost like an adventure sport. You have to be very bold. It's like climbing or something. It's not very safe. And what happens when there's so hard to cross the street is that we see a lot of people jaywalking, because human beings really want to take the shortest way to their destinations. This is a very good study. If you can see where people jaywalk, that's where you should put in the crossing. That's where the natural desire lines are. And traffic always comes up. We can't do this, there's too many cars. But looking, for instance, at this example from Copenhagen, in the city center, we also have a lot of traffic. Actually, that's not the postcard image of Copenhagen. This street has 65,000 cars per day. I think it's maybe even more than some of the streets surrounding this area. It actually also have 50,000 people, pedestrians per day. And it's super easy to cross. They're wide, generous crossings, short, you don't have to run to the other to cross the street. It's not a matter of how many cars, it's actually just a matter of making it nice for people, also in streets where we have cars. And this is just comparing to another street. This is not Tallinn, this is the image on the bottom here is from Krakow. Just as an example, a street I worked with that has exactly the same amount of traffic, even the same peak hour traffic volumes. And you can see it's completely different ways of solving a space and organizing a space. And to be honest, the Copenhagen street actually has double capacity, because if you add the number of bicyclists, they're actually peaking above number of cars in the morning and evening rush hour traffic. And it doesn't have to be an issue of costs. This is from a pilot project we worked on in Sao Paulo, where we used very little means to create some very important crossings for people. Also seeing whether, is this the right place to place a crossing? Will people use it? Also trying some new methods where you can cross the streets in different ways. And it's really about creating safe mobility for everyone. There is this golden rule you can think of if you walk around in the city and you come to a space and you think of someone you know who's 8 years old. And then you think of someone you know who's 80 years old. Would you let them out in this space by themselves? Is it safe enough? Is it good enough? If you answer yes, yeah, I think the space is actually quite good. Here in Copenhagen, all the major streets, we actually take the sidewalks across the side streets. And it's very clear design features to show who do we prioritize. And of course here, crossing the street is again this classic island jumping. You end up in these islands in traffic and you stand there in the middle of the chaos. I think again, shorten distance, shorten the space, making it just simply to cross the street is fundamental. It's simple, but it's so important in order to create a city where everyone can enjoy the spaces. And it's very important to just respect the desire lines. Sometimes you see this situation, people, they're actually supposed to go here, they don't. They take this space. So why not just use, and why not accommodate the space according to the use? And if you try really hard to prohibit pedestrians, they will find a way. This is an example from London where there is an underpath. So they'd rather climb over rather than going under and up. And I think you have a few places here in the city as well where you're sort of forced to go under. We've measured so many places where there's usually like 80 or 90% that choose to take this dangerous road just to have their feet still on the ground. And maybe you recognize, is there anyone who recognizes where this is from? Not far from here. It's from the city, it's from Tallinn. And here, this is a super dangerous road to go down. When we start to paint parking spaces on top of the sidewalk, just think of if this happens more in the city. This is not Tallinn, but there are many examples of actual people places that are inhabited by cars. And the thing about, it's not about putting cars versus people, because even people arriving by car, they are also a pedestrian. They have to get out of the car and find their way in this mess. So maybe we should start reversing that thought and think, how can we make pedestrian priority parking spaces? How can we accommodate so the time when there are fewer people driving cars, actually this could be turned into a park. It's already there. How do we actually accommodate for these parking spaces and integrate it and make it a nice part of the environment? Because they won't go away, all of them. We just have to find a way to live together and readjust the priorities. We of course know that pedestrians are so closely linked to being a public transportation user. You walk to and from the train or the metro. And you have all experienced that a distance can be experienced very long or very short according to the quality. And actually, this study from Sweden show that how you experience time is the same. So if the actual travel time is 1, if you walk to and from the transportation stop, if the quality is bad, you can actually experience it as 5 times longer time than it actually takes. And the same with the environment where you wait. If it's really bad, you can experience that 1 minute feels like 10 because it's not a pleasant environment to sit in or stay in. And I think that the public transportation here in the city has great potential because you're using it already. It just has to be turned into a more 21st century type of public transportation where it goes to where people want to go and where people are, so it's easy accessible. And the stops, the waiting. What if we actually focus our efforts on adding quality where people already are? We know people are waiting for the bus. Can we make it more pleasant environment to stop? These are all fun pictures, but it's actually a serious dimension because it's a matter of sending a message. You're using public transport, you're important to us. We actually think that you deserve a better everyday life quality. So the second consideration I think we have to ask ourselves for this area is finding a way to turn just space into actual place by inviting people to stay. I found this poor guy sitting here. Of course, if there's nowhere to sit, it's not a place where it's inviting to stay, because talking about pedestrians and bicycles, there's so much more to walking than walking. There's so much more to biking than biking. It's about stopping, it's about meeting, it's about buying a coffee, it's about falling in love. It's everything that is part of our daily life. And we have to think of pedestrians and bicycles as really a great potential for city life. It's not only movement, it's also staying. And we have studied this. We know, this is another thing that we sometimes do as a mistake, that we look at the street or the public spaces and we think that buildings, that's something different. But of course, that's part of the experience, the actual walls of the public spaces. And if we look at these categories, we have the facades that we call the A facades that have lots of doors, that are detailed, that are interesting, stimulating to us. And then we have the classic corporate look, I call it sometimes, with the glass facades and nothing interesting for us. We see that actually these active facades, they generate 7 times more activities. People stopping, people turning heads, people engaging in conversations. So we know it has a huge effect, the building fabric quality of that, in order to create nice public spaces. And looking at this area, I think we have to be very careful about creating the foundation for the public spaces by using the built fabric to support people walking, to support spaces being nice for us to spend time in. And sometimes when we think of buildings, we think of an object. But it's not really an object. It actually works in so many different levels. The ground floor being super important, because that's what we experience most, has to have a lot of details, a lot of stimulation. But then we have the second. We can't forget about the 3 to 6 story, because that's really what forms the streetscape. That's what forms the diversity when we walk, when we move. And then there's something else happening in the sky, and I think that that's a different life, and that's usually also debated. I know you have quite strict rules here in Tallinn about height. But if there's anywhere you should spend your money and use for quality, it's here, because that's what really affects us as people. A case from Copenhagen, one of the streets that links down to the waterfront. It's actually interesting that the city of Copenhagen has fairly recently also realized, wow, we have a great waterfront. And there's some destination popping up along the waterfront, but the links have come quite late. This is one of them that had about 20,000 cars per day, which is a fair amount. And still being able to turn this into very generous spaces for people to walk and sit and stop, and also thinking of this link as not an A to B thing, but a series of experiences. So if you walk further down and you hit where the school is, they've actually turned the street into a space where you can play and where you can engage with other people to make that journey much more interesting while you walk to the waterfront. So about quality, about quantity, the third thing I think we have to think about a lot is going from thinking quantity to thinking quality. You have a lot of space around here in the harbor front. So how do we actually think of these spaces and adding and using the amenity values that we have, the greenery, the water, the views, the sun, etc., but maybe shrinking it a little bit? And there is so much here. There are so many fantastic places that we shouldn't forget about. Sometimes we're so focused on making new things, cool things, that we forget about the existing things we have. And maybe just making them accessible, keeping them public, is a key thing to moving forward. And also some of the more urban water places that you have that has great potential of becoming people places is sort of sitting there waiting to be used and to become people places. Don't do like Copenhagen in this occasion. We have so many examples around the world where waterfronts become the most deserted, cold, corporate, lifeless spaces, really almost killing that amenity value. The good thing about the waterfront in Copenhagen is that there is another side. and that's this side, that actually had a completely different process. This was really a bottom-up initiative from the start. From the community that lived close to the waterfront, they wanted to have more open space and recreational space. So they created the process of creating this fantastic destination. And this has actually changed Copenhagen completely. First of all, opening eyes, realizing water is great, it's an asset, but then also having this space where everyone meets. It's something universal of spaces around water and about parks, something that actually speaks to old and young, all kind of cultures, and it's one of the spaces in Copenhagen that has the highest number of staying activity, even in wintertime. And when we talk about place, creating place, we often talk about identity. And again, it seems like us architects, me, all of us that work with this, have a tendency to think of identity as form and shape. And I think we need to shift that also and think of what activities, what kind of people can actually create the foundation of the identity of this new area, of these new spaces. I have some good stories to share, because we know that cities can change. We have a lot of examples around the world, and I think I would like to share some of them, where cities that have been able to transform their spaces, but also their thinking. And I'd like you to put yourself in another frame of mind. Don't look at these examples as solutions, because Tallinn is a unique city. Tallinn needs to find its own solutions. Think of these as examples of processes, of a way to do things, of a way from moving from A to B to C. The first example is Copenhagen. I've also already talked about it. I think the key strategic move for Copenhagen has been that there has been a focus on measuring people. I mean, we know, all cities know exactly how many cars drive in every street around the city. We seldom know how many people will walk. We seldom know anything about who is there in the spaces. And by measuring what you care about, people, Copenhagen has built the foundation of daring to do people-friendly changes. And this has also been measured since the '68. So, and every 5 years, and now the city measures itself every second year, both bicycles and pedestrians. And these numbers are quite powerful. We know that's all about people, but sometimes numbers are actually being able to change the situation. And I don't know how many of you have been in Copenhagen, but it's easy to think Copenhagen has always been this. No way. It has had as many cars, has as many traffic-dominated spaces as any city has. It started early, so in the 60s, when they wanted to transform the main street into a walking street. There were 3 arguments. People said, no way, come on, shops will die. Second argument, climate is wrong. Copenhagen, it rains, it's cold. People don't want to sit outside like Italians. That's not our culture. We're different here. And interestingly enough, these 3 arguments are the same arguments that we hear in every city we come to. The arguments that people use that is hard to come over in terms of thinking that change is possible. When the change was happening, of course, people, the shop owners were happy. Suddenly it's 80,000 people walking there along the street in 24 hours. And cultures did change. People started to sit out and have coffee. Now you can think of Copenhageners, they say they're more Italian than the Italians even. And when we're coming back to Copenhagen as a case, of course, if we want to talk about traffic, we shouldn't talk about traffic, we should talk about people movement. Because we know that unless we invite for alternative transportation, we will never be able to do anything about the volumes of cars in the streets. We know that if we build another bypass somewhere, it will fill up with new cars. So it's a super simple equation. The more infrastructure you build for cars, the more cars you get. The more infrastructure you build for pedestrians and bicycles, the more bicycles and pedestrians you get. And it's annoying how simple this equation is and how hard it is to create. Copenhagen has really had this long-time focus on bicyclists and also integrating it to all the other modes of transport. But again, remembering, it hasn't always been that way. Copenhagen also started as a city where no one biked. And even if Tallinn doesn't have a lot of bicycles today, you have huge potential. It's flat, it's good. You have space in your streets, you have too much space, so use that for something very useful, like putting bicycle lanes in. And now it's not a romantic thing to bicycle in Copenhagen. It is hardcore mobility. It's part of everyday life. 63% bike to and from work every day as Copenhageners. Why do they do that? It's not because they want to be healthy or it's cheap. It's just the most simple, fastest, quickest way to get around. So actually 70% continues when it's snowing and the rain is really bad, because it's still the simplest way to get around, even though it's a hassle to have all the clothes on. It's still a very, very good way to get around. Why does society keep on doing it? Because it's so cheap to be kind to people. Copenhagen has actually calculated that they earn 1.6 euros per people per 10-kilometer bicycled way. And they lose as a society. They have to pay for every 10 kilometers that is driven by a car. And that's like combining all factors: infrastructure cost, health benefits, people not needing to leave work, etc. And these are figures that they take so seriously. So one time they discussed to create a new pedestrian and bicycle bridge across the harbor. And there was one guy who said, well, come on, stop. Are we doing the right thing? We're actually making a shorter route now. People will bicycle shorter way. We won't earn as much money. Of course, this was taking it very far, and they built the bicycle bridge because you will get more people bicycling. Another example, Moscow. They have had a long love affair with the automobile. And the question is, could they actually say no to this? We did a project there, or a survey, a public space survey. And before we even had the time to publish it, the administration and politics, they wanted to get Jan Gehl and just whisper in their ear, what will you say in the report? Will you have any critique? And he kind of said, yeah, well, maybe we'll say something about removing some cars from your main street. So when the report was published, they had already fixed it. Maybe there's something about not wanting to be criticized or being a bit ahead, but very effective on the other hand. New York, as an example, when I started working here in 2007, Times Square wasn't really a square. It was just actually a space where 11% of the space was for people, but actually 90% of the people in the space were people on foot. So how to change that? Well, having 9 million people having an opinion on what to do with Times Square, the idea was here to say that, okay, let's try something, let's make something temporary. So these pilot projects that they were called, where Broadway was closed in sections, they were made almost overnight, a lot of planning beforehand, but actually executed very quickly. And within 48 hours, the rule was that this could be taken away. So saying that, let's try it, see if it works. If not, we can always go back here. And in this case, it was a big success. People used it. We measured that it became a lot safer, a lot less accident, lots more foot traffic. And this data, measuring before and after, really had a political impact on Bloomberg saying, let's make this permanent. And again, it wasn't perfect. It was actually a lot of issues with this first pilot project. And that's the beauty of it. It's not, we haven't spent all our money on granite. We can actually try something out in real life, see how it works, and we have the ability to change things, to accommodate for actually talking to people, also seeing what they experience as problem. And Department of Transportation, they were our clients, and they did something very interesting, that is not that well known, but I think it's maybe the greatest part of this story, is that they said, okay, Broadway, it's our flagship project. Everyone hears about it, it goes worldwide, but how do we make real impact, people, everyday life around the city? So they identified areas in the city that lacked open space. And then they said that, we will fund 3-5 new public spaces every year, but we don't know where. You guys, people in the community, has to tell us that. So you can apply to get a new public space. As an NGO, a community foundation or something, you apply and you say, we want a space. We really have an opportunity here. And by doing so, they also commit to taking care of that space, to arrange events, to clean it up. So it's automatically this partnership model, where the city provide the space and the community actually takes care of it and makes it their own. So in 7 years, 62 new public spaces has appeared around New York City. Another example that I think you know of, because you have these parking days here as well, this is something that happened and started in San Francisco 2005 by this group called Rebar that is now Gehl Architects in San Francisco. This is a completely different process. If the New York process was more of actually starting as a top-down approach, but then engaging people, this started very much as this bottom-up approach, where people demanded new public space, turned these temporary spaces into public spaces. And the good thing that the city did then was that they saw, wow, this is a great initiative. How can we make more of that? How can we make some of these permanent? So they started a parklet program, which actually engaged the local business owner or the developer that had the building. They could ask and make 2 or 3 parking spaces into more permanent public spaces that are all public, even though they look like they're cafes. And they appear now all over the city. And I think that's a great way that the city is sort of seeing and becoming more facilitating and taking in good ideas that people have executed. So now working with their main, one of the problematic streets, Market Streets, they can use this. And when we started this, we said, okay, how can this be a street that also accommodates for staying and not just moving? How can we make staying occasions along? And the first project was a collaboration with one of the stakeholders, Science Museum. And it was also all about making this street social. So these are talking dishes. So if you sit in one dish, you can actually hear what the other person is saying. And it's creating, it's a small-scale intervention, creating super interesting little urban ballet situation where people that don't know each other actually start talking. And then we thought, how do we scale this up? So we actually made a call for ideas for other type of furniture, social situations that could be applied to Market Street. And there were more than 200 ideas, and 50 of them were built as prototyped and placed in Market Street. And this was just for 3 days, and it was a great happening, and people were using them. We were evaluating what was happening. But I think the key thing with this prototype event was that we could engage with people and talk to people that were not at all interested in furniture or public space, because actually out of those 15,000 people that we talked to and discussed the future of the city, 72% of those just ran into this event as a chance. And I think that sort of calls one of the other challenges we have. How do we engage people and bring them along on the process of changing the city? And how do we engage people that are not interested? Because they also need to be part of this process. So it's all about finding these interesting ways of merging something that is good for everyone, some city goals, with all this diversity of need and wants that the people have. And thinking of a city development as a process. So rather than having one master plan, one goal for the future, thinking of how can we create more overarching goals and have guiding principles to lead us away, and then have these projects that could actually be evaluated, that we can learn from. And of course, if we have a more process-oriented development, this will change, because future holds so many surprises for us. We can't really plan the future. So the question is now, how the hell do we take all of these ideas and thinking into transforming and connecting Tallinn to the waterfront? That's what the groups are sweating about at the moment. And I just left them and came to talk to you. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Eva. Probably everybody has some questions. So just raise your hand and I will come to you with a microphone.
Oh.
It seemed so clear.
It's not, I mean, that's the thing. It's not I think when we started in New York, they asked us, they said, please, can you come and tell us what we already know? There's something about being true to some things, however basic they might be, that keeps us focusing on some basic qualities as well.
I think one interesting question was, I will just come here as well. One interesting question was when somebody asked you during these 2 days, are you taking part in the competition? And then you answered that, no, we are more focused on, strategies and so on. Maybe you can comment on that, like how you work on these processes in your office?
Well, I think maybe if you remember the diagram of having this street and the way we're divided up with different focuses, someone thinking about buildings and someone thinking about something else. I think a lot of our work is about trying to bring different parties together in a more collaborative process. And talking about people, everyone is actually interested in people and have some views because we're all people. So it's a very efficient ways of actually getting different views, but emerging into more of a shared vision that is about a people-focused or people-centered approach, if that was kind of an answer.
So even though there's an architecture competition going on, that's not all it. There has to be so much more done around it.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a step on the way, and one could think about what the question in that competition is. Is that about a design, or is it about designing a process where people can be involved in developing over time? There could be many questions to this. I don't know what you will decide.
Yes. Anybody else? Whoa.
First of all, thank you for the really nice talk. It was very good to hear about all of the examples you had. I like what you ended on. It's kind of ditching the master plan and then having just goals that you can sort of work towards incrementally. Who ultimately has the responsibility for making this shift happen?
All of us. But I think that, of course, it's an interesting question, of course, because who takes the lead and make sure that people are involved? I think municipalities, I'm hoping I'm seeing a shift, that municipalities that traditionally work as a that's a hard word, regulations. They get someone propose something and they say yes or no and they regulate. But I think that there's a shift towards being much more facilitating. So hopefully in the future also the city's role is not only to say yes or no, but actually generating and inviting people to be part of that process. But again, coming back to these cases, there are many examples where it started as a bottom-up, and the city was agile enough to take those ideas, or it could start as a city top-down, but then within that thinking, it's about involving people in the continuation of the process. Some example is developers can be really pushing for quality when they understand how valuable it is for their property value to be nice to people. So there's so many examples of where it starts, but I think I know very few examples where there's just one party that has continued all the way and finished it. So at some point in the process, we have to include more people. But maybe you will lead the process, who knows?
Anybody else? Okay, I think we will let you go back to your group, because Ewa has been working hard for 2 days and she's leading one of the groups. So we will hear from you again tonight. Thank you.